aftermath of World War II, as the Cold War took shape, the Caribbean island nation of Cuba emerged as a significant pawn in the global strategic chess game. The United States, having long wielded economic and political influence over Cuba, found its grip loosening as the fiery revolutionary Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista regime, an ally of American interests. Castro's ascent to power in 1959 heralded a shift towards socialism and nationalization of industries, including the vital sugar exports, largely controlled by U.S. companies. This shift inevitably led to a souring of relations between Havana and Washington. The geopolitical chessboard was further complicated by the Soviet Union's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, thereby achieving a strategic counterbalance to the United States' deployment of Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey. American U-2 spy planes, flying covert reconnaissance missions, brought back photographic evidence of missile installations on Cuban soil in October 1962, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis. This discovery initiated a tense standoff that lasted 13 harrowing days, during which the world seemed perched on the precipice of nuclear annihilation. The United States' response, under the leadership of President John F. Kennedy, was multifaceted, but it hinged on a naval quarantine to prevent further Soviet shipments of military hardware to Cuba. Kennedy announced this blockade, a term carefully chosen over blockade to avoid the legal connotations of war, and issued a stern warning that the U.S. was prepared to use military force if necessary to neutralize this perceived threat to national security. As the crisis unfolded, the Cuban populace braced for potential conflict, with citizens of all ages being organized into civilian militias. The island was gripped by the fear of invasion, a fear that wasn't unfounded given the Bay of Pigs invasion just a year prior. The Cuban Missile Crisis not only solidified Cuba's role as a pivotal Cold War flashpoint, but also had far-reaching economic implications for the Cuban people themselves. The United States' response to Castro's nationalization of industries was swift and severe. An embargo was instituted, severing the flow of all exports to the island except for food and medicine. The economic sanctions imposed by the embargo severely disrupted Cuba's trade and investment, leading to deteriorating infrastructure, chronic shortages of goods and supplies, and a consequential impact on the health and nutrition of the Cuban population. Additionally, the travel restrictions exacerbated the social isolation felt by Cubans, many of whom had relatives in the United States. Despite these hardships, the Cuban people cultivated a spirit of resilience and unity. They forged new alliances, notably with the Soviet Union and later with countries like China, and established informal trading networks to circumvent the embargo. The long-term cultural impact of the crisis and subsequent U.S. policies fostered poverty, an exodus of youth seeking opportunities abroad, and a scarcity of educational resources. The legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis continued to shape U.S.-Cuban relations well into the 21st century. Attempts at thawing relations, such as those initiated during the Obama administration, showed promise, but were often met with reversals or halts in policy. The enduring hope remains that future shifts in U.S. politics, along with reforms within Cuba, might pave the way for a new chapter in the relationship between these two nations, whose fates became so intertwined during those fateful 13 days in October 1962. The geopolitical climate leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis was marked by a series of confrontational and provocative actions from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The escalation can be traced back to the United States' decision to deploy Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, effectively encircling the Soviet Union with a ring of strategic threats just within striking range of its heartland. These missiles, capable of delivering nuclear warheads to the Soviet territory in a matter of minutes, were perceived by the Soviet leadership as a direct challenge to the balance of power and a threat to their national security. This tension was compounded by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by a CIA-sponsored paramilitary group of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Castro regime. The invasion was a debacle, resulting in the capture or death of the insurgents and a public relations victory for Castro. It also solidified Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union, as Castro turned to Premier Nikita Khrushchev for support against what was seen as an imminent threat of further American aggression. Khrushchev, motivated by the desire to bolster the Soviet Union's strategic position and to secure the nascent communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere, saw an opportunity to counterbalance the Jupiter missiles and to assert Soviet influence in the Americas. The installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba was not only a response to the encroachment of U.S. missiles in Europe, but also an attempt to deter another U.S. invasion of Cuba. By secretly placing medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles on the island, Khrushchev could also portray himself as a defender of the socialist cause and a strategic equal to the United States. The U.S. discovery of these missile installations was a fortuitous product of high-altitude reconnaissance flights conducted by U-2 spy planes. These flights, which had become a critical component of the United States intelligence gathering capabilities, yielded clear photographic evidence of missile assembly and construction in Cuba. The images, when analyzed, revealed the presence of Soviet SS-4 Sandal medium-range and SS-5 Skeen intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Such revelations confirmed the worst fears of the American administration and set the stage for President Kennedy's decision to confront the Soviet Union and demand the removal of the missiles, initiating the tense negotiations and military preparations that would follow. In the global chess game of the Cold War, the Soviet placement of missiles in Cuba was a bold move, one that brought the world to the brink of nuclear conflict. The motivations behind Khrushchev's decision, rooted in a complex interplay of defense, pride, and power projection, coupled with the United States' aggressive stance toward Cuba, created a volatile situation that required delicate handling to avert catastrophe. The revelation of missile bases under construction in Cuba through U-2 reconnaissance flights served as a catalyst for the ensuing crisis, one that would test the mettle and resolve of both superpowers' leaders. The discovery of missile installations on Cuban soil propelled the United States into what would become the most perilous 13 days of the 20th century. President John F. Kennedy, confronted with the specter of nuclear missiles within striking distance of American cities, deliberated over the nation's response options with his closest advisors in a series of meetings that would later be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or XCOM. The options on the table ranged from diplomatic pressure to outright military invasion. However, the president, acutely aware of the potential for catastrophic escalation, opted for a measured approach, a naval blockade of Cuba, termed a quarantine to avoid the warlike implications of a blockade. This course of action aimed to prevent further Soviet armaments from reaching the island while demonstrating U.S. resolve. As the blockade was implemented, intense negotiations ensued. Back-channel communications played a critical role in the unfolding drama. It was through these discreet channels that Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, engaged directly with Soviet Ambassador Kennedy-Dobrynin. These secret exchanges would prove to be pivotal in the eventual resolution of the crisis. During this period, the world teetered on the brink of war. The downing of an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile resulted in the death of pilot Major Rudolf Anderson, the crisis' sole direct military casualty. The incident heightened the already taut nerves of both superpowers' military forces, which were on maximum alert. In another alarming episode, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, B-59, found itself surrounded by American naval forces. Unaware that the depth charges being used were intended as warning shots, the Soviet submarine's captain believed they were under attack and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. This act, which could have sparked a full-scale nuclear war, was averted by the level-headed objection of the submarine's second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, who, under immense pressure, argued against the launch. The 13 days of the crisis were marked by a series of close calls and last-minute reprieves. As the situation evolved, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in a tense but ultimately productive exchange of letters. The two leaders, recognizing the dire consequences of miscalculation, gradually moved toward a compromise. This secret agreement, which involved the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island and an understanding about the removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey, brought the crisis to a close. In those 13 days, the world glimpsed the abyss of nuclear war, but stepped back from the precipice. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis remains a testament to the importance of diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and the courage to pursue peace even in the face of overwhelming danger. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, it was not only the superpowers that held their collective breath, but nations around the globe. The threat of nuclear war did not recognize borders, and the potential fallout would spare no country. As such, the international reaction was a mixture of fear, strategic calculation, and a desperate hope for a peaceful resolution. The United States allies, particularly those in NATO, found themselves on the front line of the Cold War's most dangerous moment. European capitals within range of Soviet intermediate-range missiles faced the reality of their own vulnerability. The crisis served to underscore the interconnectedness of American and European security, reinforcing the transatlantic bond even as it tested its limits. The British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, supported the American quarantine publicly, while also working behind the scenes to mediate a solution. International diplomatic efforts were feverish, with multiple channels of communication open to navigate the crisis. The United Nations played a pivotal role, with Secretary General U Thant acting as an intermediary between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Thant's urgent appeals for both sides to show restraint and his proposal for the withdrawal of Soviet technicians and the inspection of missile dismantlement by UN observers were instrumental in lowering the temperature of the crisis. Within the Warsaw Pact, reactions were mixed. Some Soviet allies, like Cuba, felt betrayed by the resolution of the crisis, believing that Khrushchev had capitulated to U.S. demands. Others saw the peaceful resolution as a sign of Soviet diplomatic skill. The media, meanwhile, played an unprecedented role in shaping public perception of the crisis. Television and radio broadcasts brought the high-stakes drama into living rooms around the world. Never before had the global citizenry been so instantly informed about or so intimately involved in the machinations of international diplomacy. Journalists worked around the clock, reporting on developments as they happened and providing analysis on what lay at stake. The crisis marked a maturation of the media's role in global events, as it became a forum for public debate and a stage for political leaders to communicate directly with their people. The secret agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which involved the United States secretly agreeing to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey on the condition that this part of the agreement would remain confidential, was crucial in de-escalating the crisis. This accord, negotiated away from the public eye, allowed both leaders to step back without a loss of face, an essential consideration given the domestic and international political pressures they faced. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, through a combination of public posturing and private negotiation, demonstrated the value of discreet diplomacy. The world had watched, waited, and hoped for leadership that would prioritize humanity over ideology. In the end, it was this leadership that turned the tide, ensuring that the crisis did not escalate into a conflict from which there would be no return. The media, having played a role in bringing the world to the brink, also played a part in stepping back from it, highlighting the power of information in shaping the course of history. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War, leading to immediate and long-term consequences that would shape international relations for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, one of the most significant developments was the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct communication link between the Kremlin and the White House. This hotline was intended to prevent future crises from escalating due to miscommunication or delayed diplomatic interaction, providing a means for real-time dialogue at the highest level. The crisis had a profound impact on U.S.-Soviet relations, ushering in a period of détente, characterized by a thawing of the previously icy tensions between the two superpowers. It became clear that mutual assured destruction was an unacceptable risk, and both nations took steps to reduce the likelihood of nuclear confrontation. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1963, was one such step, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. For Nikita Khrushchev, the political fallout from the crisis was significant. Although he had succeeded in securing a public U.S. guarantee not to invade Cuba, the secret removal of missiles from Turkey was seen by many in the Soviet Union as a defeat delivered by a capitulation to U.S. demands. This perception, along with economic challenges and policy failures, contributed to Khrushchev's removal from power in 1964. The Cuban Missile Crisis also left an indelible mark on U.S. foreign policy. The confrontation demonstrated the importance of flexible response, a strategy that called for a wide range of options, from diplomatic to military, to be available to the president. This approach influenced the escalation of the Vietnam War, as the United States sought to contain the spread of communism through a more hands-on approach than it had in Cuba. The enduring lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis revolve around the art of crisis management and the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship. The crisis underscored the importance of leadership, communication, and the careful calibration of threats and concessions. It highlighted the necessity of understanding an adversary's motivations and the value of empathy in negotiations. The crisis also showed the importance of having clear and reliable channels of communication, both within governments and between rival states. The legacy of those 13 days in October 1962 continues to inform modern diplomacy and international relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a powerful case study in the management of foreign policy crises and the avoidance of nuclear war. It serves as a constant reminder of the thin line between conflict and peace and the perpetual need for vigilant, informed, and prudent stewardship of national and global security.